There's a line of Thornton Wilder's that I keep coming back to in my mind. The playwright says, "We can only be said to be alive in those moments when our hearts are conscious of their treasures." I love that. I love that idea that we are somehow more fully alive when we appreciate, when we see what it is we have, when we recognize what it is we've been blessed with, when we respond to grace with gratitude, in other words, and that we are somehow less fully alive without that appreciation, without that consciousness of our treasures, without that awareness that we call gratitude. And I've been thinking about that, looking ahead to this coming Sunday's reading from Luke's Gospel, a story that you may well have heard before, but that keeps finding new ways to poke me. This comes from Luke chapter 17, and the story goes like this. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God, except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." It's a story with a punchline that maybe we've lost the feel for. That the one person who recognizes that he's been healed and stops and goes back to thank Jesus, the wandering, homeless, itinerant rabbi who has brought about this healing, the one who gets it is the foreigner, the one who's got the wrong culture and language and dialect, whose voice and language and talking speech sounds funny, who has the wrong religion, who's got all these cultural reasons why he's the misfit, right? On top of having this contagious skin disease that makes him an outcast, and he has to hang out with and live with other outcasts who have the same disease so they don't spread it to others. He's the one who gets it. He's the one who's maybe most conscious of his treasures, aware of what has been done for him. And in that sense, he's more fully alive, maybe. Now, the thing that I just can't shake about this story is, despite the fact that clearly this one foreigner who has leprosy, who comes back and thanks Jesus, clearly he's got this insight. He sees, he understands, he's grateful in a way that the others seem to be so busy with they don't stop to come back and thank Jesus. But Jesus doesn't undo the miracle for the 9 who don't voice any thanks to him. That's the nature of grace. Grace has a certain recklessness to it, a certain audacity to it that is willing to be good even when no thanks or recognition are given back. Part of the nature of grace is that it's reckless, it's unconditional. Jesus, without even insisting on anybody saying thank you, just gives this blanket healing to all 10 of them. In fact, Jesus almost buries the miracle. He doesn't say, "Now I'm going to perform a miracle and heal you." He just says, "Go on your way to the priest," as if to say, "Hey, you're already clean, go show yourselves to the priest." And it's on the way that the miracle happens. It would be easy if you were any one of those healed people to miss that it had happened, or not to realize that Jesus was the source of it. Grace is like that. God keeps taking the risk that we won't appreciate it. God keeps taking the risk that we won't give thanks or recognize the goodness of God in our lives. And God doesn't take away good things when we aren't sufficiently grateful. In fact, Jesus has made a center point of his teaching in Luke's Gospel that at the heart of God's character is this unconditional mercy that is kind, even, Jesus says, to the ungrateful and the wicked in his version of the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, at the heart of who God is a willingness to do good even when we don't appreciate or recognize or thank God enough for it or appropriately. Grace still has a way of responding and meeting us and finding us and healing us. And yet, somehow we are more fully alive when we realize that we have been graced. In a way, that's the whole perspective Jesus offers in his teaching over and over again. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount something like, God gives sun and rain on everybody, right? On the just and the unjust alike. God keeps giving good things all around. But when you recognize that, when you realize that God has this reckless way of doing good all around, it does have a way of changing things. It does have a way of changing our response, of helping us to see and have our eyes opened to see how grace upon grace, goodness upon goodness, blessing upon blessing is given to us day after day. And we are constantly awash in these good things. So often instead we choose to read the world like everything is a matter of our striving and earning and hard work, when Jesus says, no, my goodness, you're being given grace upon grace upon grace, and we treat ourselves as the heroes who make good things happen because of our hard work, when instead Jesus is everything good turns out to have been a gift of grace that is given recklessly and generously and extravagantly all around. It's a very different way of reading the world. It's a different way of seeing. And when we see differently, when we practice gratitude that way, it has a way of drawing us closer into relationship with God who has already been gracious to us. There's a line of the recently deceased theologian Frederick Buechner, who in one of his books gives a working definition for what it means to be a Christian. And he goes through first a list of things that a Christian isn't. He notices that Christians are not necessarily any holier or wiser or smarter than anybody else. They're not necessarily any better behaved, that they're not necessarily any better at Bible reading than other people. They're someone who's on the way, he says. And there's someone who has a half-decent idea of whom to thank in this life. That's an important recognition, that as followers of Jesus, maybe it's not that we're holier or better or smarter than anybody else, and we should give up any notion that we are, but rather we've been given some insight in whom to thank for the blessings that are lavished upon us and upon this world. That maybe at our best we could be like the hero in this story, that the foreigner who recognizes he's been graced and stops to say thank you to Jesus. It doesn't take miraculous healing for us to practice that gratitude. Maybe what it takes, though, is the willingness to stop and to pause in the course of our very busy lives and to see what it is we've been given, to take a moment to notice, to appreciate, to savor, and then to be moved to thanks in response. Not because if we don't say thank you well enough, God will take away the good things. That's back to sad, tired, old transactional thinking again, and Jesus has taught us to get rid of that altogether. But instead, because we are drawn more fully into life, into relationship with God, the more fully we realize just how we have been graced. When we practice gratitude, it has a way of making us more fully alive. Or, like Thornton Wilder says, we can only really be said to be alive in those moments when our hearts are conscious of our treasures. So come join us this Sunday in worship, when we won't just talk about being thankful or practicing gratitude, but when in worship we do that, we name the treasures, the blessings, and offer our thanks back to God, not as repayment, but because in the conversation, in the practice of gratitude, in the recognizing of this blessing and this blessing and this blessing, and saying thank you for this, God. It didn't have to be this way, and we are blessed with this goodness. Thank you for that. We find ourselves drawn up more closely and deeply into relationship with God, and we find ourselves more fully alive. That's the conversation we're having this Sunday. So join us there. See you Sunday.